All right, so the first step of publishing your podcast is to save your podcast in a publishable format. So far, we've been working in GarageBand, but we can't upload a GarageBand file as a podcast. Well, technically you could do this, but then people would need GarageBand in order to play and listen to your podcast. And for that matter, they'll also be able to see your individual tracks, your edits, and anything else you've done in the GarageBand project. Most likely, you don't want your podcast published this way. So instead, you're going to export it as an MP3 file. MP3 stands for MPEG-1 Audio Layer 3, which is basically the codec used for encoding a sound file. Codec stands for compression-decompression. Don't you just love all these acronyms? The MP3 format reduces the size of an audio file by analyzing it and throwing away information that's not important for maintaining audio fidelity. But the ingenious part of the MP3 format is that it works by, among other things, keeping the frequencies within the range of human hearing and then throwing away the things we can't hear. The whole point is to strike a balance between file size and audio quality, and the MP3 format does a pretty great job of this, which is why it's still the standard format for sharing audio files online. So my podcast is pretty much mixed the way I want. I have everything arranged the way I want. There's one more thing I need to do before I export this as an MP3. Notice that after the very last region here in my project, which ends right around the 5-minute 6-second point, I have all this blank space that goes almost all the way to 5 minutes 40 seconds. If I were to export my file as an MP3 right now, it would include this long gap of silence at the end. So what I need to do is close this gap. Now this is a little bit tricky due to the interface here, because right behind the zoom controls, we have an end marker, and it's hidden right behind those zoom controls. But if you move your cursor towards the top of the right of the zoom controls, you'll see your cursor turn into this shape, which means you can start dragging over to the left. And I'll need to do that again. I'm just going to drag that right up to the last region there. That tells GarageBand that the content stops right here, so there's no need to include any extra silence. And again, if you don't do this and you have some silence at the end, that silence will be included in the final file. All right, so at this point, I'm ready to export this as an MP3. I'll come up to the Share menu, and out of the many options we have here, we're going to choose Export Song to Disk. This allows us to save the exported file to any location on the computer instead of copying it into iTunes or exporting it to some other location. Now, if you prefer to save your podcasts as MP3s into your iTunes library, you can do that too, but I like to keep them separate from my iTunes library and in their own folder. So first I'll name this file. It's a good idea to name your podcast episodes numerically so they'll be easier to keep track of as you record more episodes. So let's say this is the first episode of my new podcast. I'll name it 001 _ and maybe because I interviewed Todd Howard in this podcast, I'll call this TH interview. I like this naming convention because with the numbers at the beginning of the name, I'm free to name the rest of the file something that will remind me what's in this particular episode. But because of the numbering, all of my podcasts will be listed in order in the folder I save them into. You can, of course, name your files however you like, but I recommend numbering them and staying consistent. In most cases, your listeners will never see the file name, so you can name your files in a way that just makes sense to you. Next, I'll choose a location to save the file. I'm going to go out to my desktop and create a folder. I'll just call it Podcast Episodes. You'll probably want to choose some other location on your Mac so as not to clutter up your desktop. I'll just create that. And then, most importantly, I'm going to make sure that MP3 is selected here as the file type. You can also specify the quality level you want for your MP3s. The default high quality setting is a good one to go with. It strikes the best balance between file size and audio quality. Now, if your podcast is particularly lengthy and you're concerned about generating a large file, you could go down to the medium quality, and most people probably wouldn't notice. But these days, it won't make much of a difference to anyone with a high-speed internet connection. So I'll leave that set to high quality. And that's pretty much all there is to it. I can now click Export, and GarageBand will take a few moments to export the MP3. And once it's complete, I can hide GarageBand for a moment. And here's the folder I created on my desktop. And there's the MP3 of my podcast. And this is the file that I'll be uploading to my hosting service, which will then in turn be downloaded by anyone who wants to listen to or subscribe to my show.